Ever heard of a sea trial? Are there any maritime history buffs among us who know what one is? A sea trial is the testing phase between the launching of a ship and her maiden voyage. It is also known as a shakedown cruise. It's usually the last phase of construction. It takes place on open water. It may last from a few hours to many days. The purpose of a sea trial is to measure the vessel's performance and general seaworthiness. It usually includes the testing of the vessel's speed, maneuverability, equipment, and safety features. In a fine and fairly recent work on the sinking of the Titanic, Daniel Allen Butler so illustrates. On the morning of April 2nd, 1912, the most magnificent sight Belfast would ever see presented itself as the Titanic, drawn by 4 tugboats, slowly made her way down the Victoria Channel to the Belfast Lock to begin her sea trials. One by one, the boilers were lit until 20 had been fired. Just before noon, Captain Edward J. Smith ordered hoisted from the bridge the blue and white signal flag A, which communicates the message, "I am undergoing sea trials." 3 long blasts were given from the Titanic's siren. The next several hours were spent making a prolonged series of twists and turns, followed by a succession of runs straight across the lock and back. The highest speed she was able to meet during these runs was 18 knots. During one of these runs, Captain Smith made a test to see how quickly she could stop. With both engines reversed and the turbines stopped, the Titanic came to a halt in 3 minutes and 15 seconds. The distance was 3,000 feet. By dusk, both owners and builders seemed satisfied. The Titanic returned to Belfast to drop off most of the Harland and Wolff shipyard workers who had accompanied the ship on her sea trials. 8 remained on board, including Thomas Andrews, who had designed the ship. These would be making the maiden voyage to assist on solving any technical problems that might come up during the crossing. That night, Titanic steamed down the Irish Channel and around the Lizard Peninsula to the port of Southampton to begin coaling and provisioning. Sailing day would be April 10th. And for the rest of the story, I'd like to recommend Kate Winslet and Leonardo DiCaprio. However, I would like to look at trials of a slightly different kind. And these are trials that we typically face in life, which may be of a more stressful nature. As my seminary professor, Carl Laney, puts it, trials of this kind are a testing sent from God to prove the genuineness of a believer's faith. What are some common trials we face as teachers? On the one hand, here we are with perhaps not merely a job to do, but a mission to fulfill. Perhaps it's a mission for which we set out to fulfill passionately, to wholeheartedly impart to others what we have discovered and are excited about. On the other hand, as we may know all too well, there are also ways that the very people to whom we're venturing to serve can sort of get in the way. And sometimes, as we may well know, this has a way of making it almost, but not quite, impossible. Is there anybody listening who is not already thinking of examples of this from their own experience? But it's a situation in which you have your lesson all planned out and you're excited to get down to it. However, when your kids come to class, they are resistant and uncooperative. Their hearts are 93% elsewhere. What means so much to you means so little to them. Or perhaps sometime it comes in the form of some small misunderstanding that happens on the fly between you and a student, right as you're into presenting the lesson. It may be over something to which you may have responded seeing as more of an aside, incidental or trivial. And maybe it might have made you a little bit impatient with this student in that moment for having chosen right then to bring it up. Even so, you weren't thinking a whole lot of it because right at that moment, you were more focused and in the teaching process. However, your student sees things differently. And because of the tone in which they hear you as having responded, they have a problem. And they go after you for it. They go home to their parents with a version of what's happened that's blown way out of proportion. And then the parents may come in and get really nasty with you, perhaps even getting your administrator involved. And nobody really seems to be giving your side of it a completely fair hearing. And as a result, you are now faced with this to clean up before you can move on. And indeed, it may take a really long time before all of this water is completely under the bridge. Or perhaps it might be the time that that administrator comes in to observe your class. And after just one 40-minute session, there is practically nothing to be said on anything about your actual lesson itself, which you've busted your tail to get prepared and make meaningful for your students. Instead, practically everything to be said is about that one little thing of which not enough evidence was demonstrated as you went about the lesson. Indeed, it's probably that one silly little thing, which is according to some current fad or trend in educational philosophy, over which your district is all enthusiastic, gung-ho, and really on the bandwagon. But meanwhile, here you are, personally having a really hard time seeing the relevance of in the context of your own classroom. That's right, I'm talking about one of those. What are some typical ways that a typical teacher might be tempted to respond when it comes to these kinds of things? We're only human. We know what can happen when we are forced to operate under a certain degree of stress. And we know how too much of it without a coping mechanism can lead to burnout and diminished effectiveness in carrying out our mission. As we continue to explore this, I'd like to propose a thought that goes something like this. Tackling tons of typically trying temptations, take a total thrill toward triumphant trust. I'll say it again. Tackling tons of typically trying temptations, take a total thrill toward triumphant trust. In the words of the Apostle James, consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. This is from James chapter 1, verses 2 and 3. James, the writer of this book of his namesake, is believed by many to be the half-brother of Jesus. He was a leader in the early Jerusalem church around the time of the writing of the book of Acts, which is described as a time of trials in the form of persecution against the Christian believers and their churches. Some of these trials included forms of temptation faced in response to persecution. The audience to whom he was writing were actually believers everywhere, not only those who were contemporary to his time, but everyone throughout the history of the church, even all of us today. The genre of the book of James is wisdom literature, and it presents a practical skills how-to perspective in how to apply in everyday life what the apostles taught. And even so with issues that commonly come up as we personally live in the faith, even so today. So, in tackling tons of typically trying temptations, how do we take a total thrill toward triumphant trust? How do we consider it pure joy? For some, joy may be seen as synonymous with happiness. Personally, I do not see this as quite accurate. Happiness has more to do with happenstance, feeling pleased in a given moment according to what is happening all around us. Joy, however, is something a little different. Joy is more of an attitude of the heart. It's more disciplined and according to one's own volition. And joy is actually in spite of what may or may not be happening. Joy is a conscious choice to remain positive and peaceful and content, no matter what. Synonyms for joy include delight or rejoicing, or, as I saw in one Oxford Thesaurus, thrill. Joy has to do with contentment, a contentment in seeing trials as more something to anticipate or expect, not to be surprised by, but rather to welcome with open arms, to be glad for them. Even to the point of maybe considering, when there are no trials, that something may then be actually not quite right. Without them, the picture may actually be incomplete. How do we go about taking a total thrill toward triumphant trust? This has to do with something called faith. In Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1, faith is described as the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. Faith is a confidence in who God is and what he promises us, even in times when it isn't always clear and obvious as to how he's going to follow through. For instance, when we're right in the thick of ways, we get tested as teachers. And then there's to trust, which means to apply faith, to put faith into action, especially in those times when we really cannot see what immediately lies ahead. Even when those pupils and parents, principals, princes, and all those other powers that be only seem to be trying to stop us dead in our tracks. Consider it pure joy, my brothers and sisters, whenever you face trials of many kinds, because you know that the testing of your faith produces perseverance. What is perseverance? Perseverance is endurance, or a strengthened trust to not give up and throw in the towel, but whatever the matter, to see it through to completion. In other words, to not merely trust, but to trust triumphantly, to trust in faith that there is something of value to be gained through enduring it to its final conclusion. Amidst the chaos, perseverance is a peaceful and quiet assurance that this is ultimately how things are going to work out. And this is important. The benefit of perseverance is similar to the benefit of sea trials, as they help a ship's captain and her crew to better understand their vessel later while they are out at sea. Taking a total thrill or considering it pure joy whenever we face trials of many kinds. In other words, tackling tons of typically trying temptations, because we know that the testing of our faith produces endurance toward triumphant trust. When life comes to put you to the test, especially with something you really didn't see coming, how do you tend to respond? How would you like to be able to respond? Remember, with the challenges with which we are presented today, there are always ways we can benefit from them tomorrow. Or as teachers in general, how about other methods and techniques we may use to stimulate the learning experience? Along the same lines, we can also learn what God has to teach us if we know how to do so. Tackling tons of typically trying temptations, take a total thrill toward triumphant trust.